Over 500 years ago, America is still a barren land. The indigenous Indians lived a quiet and peaceful and uncontested life on this land. But they don't think about the time after that. The land where they had lived for generations was a nightmare. They wouldn't even think about it. Over the next few hundred years, an incomparably powerful empire was born on this land. Early 15th century, with the development of the European commodity economy and the emergence of capitalism. Europe is strong. Domestic trade is no longer content with capitalist expansion. But then the Ottoman Turks controlled the overland Silk Road, and our country's ancient shipbuilding and compass technology have been introduced to Europe. Therefore, the European powers began to seek the maritime Silk Road to open up sea trade routes between East and West. The age of great navigation began. In 1492, Christopher Columbus was supported by the Spanish royal family. Carrying credentials for the monarchs of India and the emperors of China, they set off across the ocean. However, Columbus' voyage did not directly reach the Eastern powers, but accidentally discovered the American continent. Then Columbus's voyages and discoveries shocked Spain and all of Europe. Western European countries invaded and expanded massively into the Americas. Spain soon became the first colonial empire of the Japanese tribes. However, the American Indians began to fall into the abyss of colonial misery and bloodshed. After Columbus discovered America, the establishment of colonial slavery in Latin America, it brought great disaster to the Indians. Marx pointed out in Spendin that weekly discoveries of places of origin, the extermination of indigenous populations, enslaved and buried in mines, the conquest and plundering of the East Indies began. Africa becomes a business. Class fire. Black place. This heralded the dawn of the era of capitalist production, the discovery of the New World. European powers also came to him. Excited. They all want to grab the first piece of cake in this undeveloped land. So, in 1607, the first permanent British colony in North America was Jamestown, Virginia. And in the 1660s, some Britons fled religious oppression, start a new great migration to the Americas. In 1620, a ship named the Mayflower set sail for Virginia in America. However, a storm changed their direction, stopped more than 500 miles from Virginia. But they have no right to stay on this land forever. In fact, he was also out of the jurisdiction of the Eagle King at this time. But in order to obtain the legitimacy of a permanent stay, so the group got together. They signed a contract together on the deck of the Mayflower. Implementation qualification. This contract is also known as the Mayflower Convention. This time America's story begins here. And this convention became the birth certificate of the United States. In the nearly 100 years since then, large numbers of people from the European continent began to migrate to the Americas. The North American colonies also expanded to 13. Before 1760, the British mainland maintained good trade relations with the North American colonies. Maritime transportation is also very developed. However, between 1756 and 1763, Britain and France fought an extremely expensive youth war. To make up for the losses in the war, the British began to tax the colonies. This led to strong dissatisfaction among the people of the North American colonies. In 1773, the British Parliament helped the East India Company weather its financial crisis, granted it a monopoly on a large amount of Qingxiao tea in North America. And this was met with strong resistance from the people of North America. The Boston Tea Incident broke out. This incident exacerbated the conflict between the British mainland and the North American colonies. Then the British Parliament issued a compulsory decree in 1774, closed Boston Harbor, and sent more troops to loot houses. A series of high-pressure operations by the British Parliament against the North American colonies, directly restricting the freedom of the people of Boston, and cut off the people's source of income. It also made the people of the 13 colonies in North America feel like they were starting to unite, embarked on the path of violence against Britain. September 5, 1774. Delegates from the North American colonies gathered in Philadelphia. The First Continental Congress of North America was held. Colonial representatives began to conspire to discuss armed responses and independent statehood. Half a year later, April 18, 1775, Lexington's militia accidentally fired the first shot in the reaction. Since then, smaller battles have broken out at the airport. Although the scale of this airport battle is not large, but it means that armed competition between Britain and the United States is inevitable. July 4, 1776. The Second Continental Congress of North America was held in Viking. The conference adopted the world-renowned Declaration of Independence, officially declared 13 North American colonies free from British colonial rule. The meeting decided that it was impossible to establish a state, establishment of a regular military force, and chose Washington as commander-in-chief. The War of Independence broke out. Between 1776 and 1781, Britain and the United States negotiate while fighting. Finally, the United States, with the support of France, the main force of the British Army, completely disintegrated on the North American continent, and signed the Treaty of Paris in September 1783. Britain officially recognizes the independence of the United States. The 8-year American War of Independence was finally won. In 1787, the Philadelphia Conference adopted the constitutions of the United States and China. From then on, the United States is no longer a loose country. The Constitution established that sovereignty resides with the people. Separation of powers. Principles such as republicanism. For the United States, the subsequent prosperity and strength laid the institutional foundation. And here's what's interesting. At the pre-Philadelphia Conference, regarding the federal system, American politics has been divided into federal and anti-federal cards. By 1789, the first federal government was established. Federalists hold power. By 1791, the anti-federalists gradually developed into the Democratic-Republican Party, which was dominated by state Democratic forces. And after 1824, the Democratic and Republican parties split into Democrats and Republicans. The latter continued the Federalist political tradition. So the typical two-party political struggle in the United States. In fact, at the beginning of the Establishment Conference in 1787, the first intention was already seen. In 1789, the first Congress of the United States declared the United States Constitution effective. It was the first constitution in the world to be adopted as an independent, unified country. In the same year, Washington, who performed well in the Revolutionary War, was unanimously elected as the first president of the United States. During his tenure, he established a cabinet of federal government entities, promulgation of judicial regulations, establishment of the federal Supreme Court. It really established a federal republican form of government. Therefore, Washington is also known as the wealth of the United States. March 1797. Washington officially handed over power to Adams, ended his 8-year presidential term. It also set a precedent for the U.S. president to serve no more than 2 terms. The first Anglo-American War was the American War of Independence. The United States finally won the War of Independence. Declare the founding of a country. It was the founding of the United States. The Second Anglo-American War. Essentially, because of the war between the 2 countries over the Canadian colony, it all began with the American Revolution. The British had already deployed a large number of troops in the Canadian colonies, ready to make a comeback against the United States at any time. And after American independence, Britain and the United States continued to face friction in maritime trade. In 1812, war broke out in Europe. America takes advantage of Britain. Take into account America. Start moving north. The Second American War begins. But the war did not go as smoothly as the United States had expected. By August 1814, the British even directed the Yellow Dragon to capture Washington. Then U.S. President Madison fled in a hurry. The British carried out a massive sabotage operation in Washington. The White House and Capitol building were on fire. America almost fell. Just when America was extremely sad. There is a turnaround in the South. Jackson steps up, saved America's decline. December 1814. Jackson led his army in a very beautiful defensive battle in West Orleans and devastated the British army. After that, the two sides fell into a state of anxiety. Win or lose. At the end of December 1814, the two sides are signing an armistice with Trump. In this war, neither Britain nor the United States took any advantage. It didn't change any warship form, but further affirms the independence of the United States. After that, the United States could no longer go north. Instead, start expanding westward. In 1830, President Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act. The United States began a massive westward movement. Mass deportations and massacres of indigenous Indians began. The Shijing movement gave the United States access to a large amount of fertile land and a vast domestic market. Let the American economy take a leap forward. The Indians originally owned this land, but in the process of America's rise, they paid a heavy price. It can be said that the history of the development of the United States is also the tragic acute point history of the Indians. The success of the attack campaign let the United States accumulate a large amount of capital. By 1846, the United States seeks to further expand its territorial reach. He traced his gaze to Mexico in the south. May 1846. The Memo War broke out. The war of aggression initiated by the United States lasted nearly 2 years. Finally, in January 1848, the two sides of Memo came to the negotiating table. It's a negotiation. Mexico has no leverage, but the United States has the advantage. Eventually, Mexico ceded large tracts of land, including California. The United States won a great victory in this war. The southern expansion has been very profitable. Mid-19th century, the Shijing movement triggered a gold rush in the United States. The American War allowed the United States to acquire a large amount of land, and that includes California. California used to be a barren land, and San Francisco is just a backwater fishing village. However, in 1848, a worker accidentally discovered a large amount of gold here. For a time, countless gold diggers flooded into the village. San Francisco would later become San Francisco. In just a few decades, California's population is growing rapidly. Wealth keeps increasing. Jinshan has become the most international city in the United States. So California, as a new member of the United States, both the northern industrial state and the southern region of Luzhu are eyeing it. This also directly exacerbated the contradiction between the North and the South, indirectly led to the outbreak of the Civil War. In fact, in the more than 70 years since the founding of the country, two very different economies emerged in the United States: the capitalist economy in the North and the slave economy in the South. Although there are black slaves in both the North and the South, when it came to slavery, we had the opposite reaction. Northern Industrial Week completes industrialization through capital expansion to replace human labor and emancipate slaves. The investment in the southern states was mainly used to buy more slaves. By pressure labor, no need to accumulate capital. By 1830, the slave population in the United States has reached more than 1 million. Most are concentrated in the southern states. The slaves in the South were mainly engaged in cotton farming, so this cotton is covered in the blood of black slaves. The differences in the economic systems of the North and the South. It will inevitably lead to the irreconcilability of the contradictions of economic development in the later stage. As early as 1807, Jackson signed the ban on the importation of slaves into law, but it's very difficult. Until 1860, Republican Abraham Lincoln became the 16th President of the United States. The first thing Lincoln did after taking office was to lead the United States to abolish slavery. This led directly to the great dissatisfaction of Southern slave owners. Then launch a rebellion. In 1861, the Civil War broke out. The Battle of Fort Sumter ushered in the Civil War. January 1st, 1863. Lincoln officially issued and implemented the Emancipation Proclamation, allowing black slaves in the United States to obtain legal citizenship. Get free. This declaration also allowed a large number of black compatriots to join the Northern camp, enhanced the combat effectiveness of the Northern camp. The American Civil War lasted for years, but in the end, the North won the war completely. The Emancipation Proclamation was a turning point in the American Civil War. Unfortunately, because extremism pervaded Lincoln's approach. April 1865. Lincoln was assassinated at the Washington Opera House. The abolition of slavery. It also made Lincoln one of the greatest presidents in American history. In 1865, the end of the American Civil War. Avoid the risk of the country being divided. But Republicans and Democrats have been deadlocked. At first, the United States has maintained a political situation dominated by the Republican Party. And with the rise of the Democratic Party, the United States is gradually forming a situation where the two major parties are evenly matched. To avoid another civil war, realize the unified reconstruction of the country. Both parties know that it is essential to develop. Collaboration began in 1877. Democrats and Republicans reach a compromise. Democrats recognize Republican president. The Republican Party has also temporarily shelved its goal of racial equality. Withdraw Union troops from the South. Stop promoting racial equality in the South. We stopped supporting the Black Power movement in the South. A bipartisan compromise. Avoided the crisis of a civil war in the United States. The country was able to achieve unified reconstruction. But the reconciliation between the two parties was a betrayal of the black community. The fruits of the Civil War draw were not preserved. The Black All-Out movement has a long way to go. After the bipartisan compromise in 1877, the United States is once again moving towards unity. No more internal contradictions. So he began to focus his energy abroad. In 1882, Congress passed the Wandering Act, prohibit Chinese workers from joining the United States. Other non-working Chinese entering the United States are also subject to restrictions. As early as the mid-19th century, the news of the discovery of gold in California reached China. Many Chinese crossed the ocean to join the American gold rush. And in 1868, the United States signed the Anshan Treaty with the Qing government. The two sides agreed to respect free immigration. In the 1860s, the United States built the Pacific Railroad. Most of it is done by chemical construction. However, with the decline of the American economy, the tide of people wandering is gradually intensifying. The American people believe that Chinese foodie and the treatment requirements are extremely low, cause its own flooding and flight robbery, and the battle between the two parties. In order to win more popular votes, the Chinese have become the sacrifice of the two parties. May 9, 1882, President Arthur signs the Flower Act. By 1888, on this basis, the terms were expanded. Further photography of Chinese. Therefore, during this period, many Chinese were massacred and persecuted in the United States. The Wandering Act became the first law in U.S. history to restrict immigration by a specific race. It was one of the toughest bloodline policies in American history. More in jurisprudence. Discrimination against the Chinese community. Until World War II, China and the United States become an anti-fascist alliance. President Roosevelt repealed the bill, which was full of discrimination against Chinese people. Late 19th century. The overall economic strength of the United States has jumped to the #1 in the world. The hyperinflated economy pushes the already reckless United States to expand even more wildly. In search of new sources of raw materials, commodity sales markets, and investment venues, to extract more high monopoly profits, the United States began to expand its colonies. But by this time, the whole world had been divided among the old colonial powers, and Spain on Mount Zeboshi became the first target of the United States. In 1894, the United States went to war with Spain. The Spanish-American War broke out, and the first target is Cuba on the doorstep of the United States. Cuba was originally a colony of Spain. Spain brutally exploited and oppressed the Cuban people during its colonization. The Cuban people then initiated the Kangxi ambiguity, and Spain's brutal and bloody crackdown provided ample justification and pretext for U.S. involvement. April 1898. The United States and Spain in Southeast Asia. Cuba goes to war in 3 places in the Caribbean. The Spanish-American War lasted nearly 4 months. In the end, Spain lost to the United States. December 10, 1898. Messi signs Paris Contract. Since then, Spain has renounced Cuba and recognized its independence. Cession of Guam and Puerto Rico to the United States. It also transferred sovereignty over the Philippine Islands to the United States for $20 million. The United States passed this battle, officially proclaimed to the West its strength among the great powers. Victory in the Spanish-American War also gave the United States overseas colonies. With the radical Roosevelt coming to power, the United States has officially embarked on the path of overseas colonial expansion, opened the door to global hegemony. In 1901, Theodore Roosevelt was elected the 26th President of the United States. Theodore Roosevelt was the youngest man president in American history. His unique personality and reformist policies make him one of the greatest presidents in American history. After taking office, vigorously cracked down on monopoly giants at home, developing the Monroe Doctrine, bringing America under complete American control, foreign colonial expansion, boost naval power, open door policy in Asia. After taking office, he single-handedly raised the United States to the position of the world's police. During Roosevelt's election as president, progressivism and expansionism became the hallmarks of American politics during this period, and later presidents were also deeply influenced by it. In 1907, a very serious financial crisis broke out in the United States, with no lower bound envelope financial market free, lack of unified supervision of financial markets. Many banks, trusts suck a lot of social money into the stock market, and the instability of the stock market, the volatility caused several waves, leading to a large number of companies and banks declaring bankruptcy. And that brought to the attention of many U.S. lawmakers. That is, you can no longer leave the finance alone. Let it develop freely. By 1910, U.S. Senator Niels Old joined with representatives of many top banks to discuss the formulation of the first central bank building program. The attendees were the president of the National City Bank of New York, Morgan Consortium, a well-known figure in financial circles such as the Assistant Secretary of Finance. So after many discussions, the Aldrich Project was born. It was a programmatic document that created the government's central bank. Virtually every functional sector is contracted by private banks, named state-owned, real private. Private banks reap huge profits from this every year. Now this program, of course, was not accepted by the American people at the time, and each week established its own banking system. So the resistance to implementation is relatively large, and so the plan was never approved. Wilson was elected President of the United States in 1912. He believed that the Aldrich Plan had paved the way for bankers before the financial monopoly. But there is nothing wrong with the overall framework. So Wilson arranged for the relevant personnel to make revisions based on the plan. It became the Federal Reserve Act. At the same time, on the basis of the original system department, the federal government has the voice-over By December 22, 1913, after many twists and turns, the US Congress finally passed the Federal Reserve's visit. On December 23rd, the Federal Reserve was officially established. The establishment of the Federal Reserve. The bankers were successful. This bill not only strengthens the US government's supervision of financial markets, regulate financial market, reduce financial market risk. It also influenced the world's economic structure in the future. Late 19th and early 20th century. With the Second Industrial Revolution and the rise of monopolies, the major capitalist powers have developed to the stage of imperialism. Under the influence of the law of unbalanced economic and political development of capitalism, these imperialist countries waged a fierce struggle for world hegemony and colonies. July 1914. The First World War broke out. At this time, the United States was a neutral country. Earn a lot in the war. In addition to reselling arms, the United States also took advantage of the chaos to take over the vast overseas colonies of the old European colonial empires. In World War I, America is not short of European wool. By 1915, the Lusitania incident broke out. The deterioration of US-German relations became an important factor in America's entry into the war. At the same time, the United States wants to gain greater benefits in Europe. The gods must be deeply involved in European affairs to seize the European initiative. So, in 1917, the United States joined the Entente under the banner of maintaining world peace. Declare war on the Allies. The United States hastened the end of World War I by participating in the war in the later stages of World War I. In 1918, the First World War was coming to an end. The United States couldn't wait to plan for the post-war world order. I want to become the leader of the world. So President Wilson of the United States proposed a 14-point peace plan at the time. This plan is only to repartition the old European colonies. The United States has a piece of the action, but it also has the initiative in its hands. This was too exciting for Britain and France, which had seized a large number of colonies. So the old empires didn't buy it at all. So in June 1919, the Allied powers signed the Treaty of Versailles. Wilson's 14-point peace plan was largely ignored. The first American plan to seize world hegemony was aborted. But the European powers at the time may not have realized it. The United States has become the largest economy in the world. The total amount of industry has exceeded the sum of Britain and Germany. After the First World War, he made a fortune from the war and harvested the chassis. At the beginning of the 20th century, he had become the largest upstart in the world. Although Wilson's 14-point peace plan failed. But at this time, the European colonial powers were seriously wounded in the First World War. The United States is gradually playing the role of savior in global affairs. The century center began to shift from Europe to the United States. Becoming the world leader is only a matter of time. After the First World War, the world is entering a relatively flat phase. The global economy is beginning to recover. The United States relies on the advantages it has accumulated in the war. Take the economy to the next level. Entered a period of rapid development and prosperity. So at that time, many famous cultural companies were born in the United States. Like Disney as we know it, Time and so forth. However, this prosperity did not last long. By 1929, the economic crisis broke out again in the United States. The Great Depression was sweeping across the country. Unemployment, bankruptcy, extreme cold covers the land. Plus, the gang is rampant. Government corruption. The Gold Bill has given rise to a series of social problems. In 1933, Franklin Roosevelt was on a mission. Take over the presidency of the United States. After Roosevelt took office, with its excellent governance skills, launched a series of plans to rescue the economy. The New Deal. Roosevelt actively promoted the implementation of the New Deal. The U.S. economy has seen a rapid recovery. Roosevelt saved the economy. He also became a four-term president in the history of the United States. The world economic crisis of 1929 planned the internal contradictions in Germany. In 1931, the Japanese made the September 18th incident. It kicked off World War II. The Germans launched an attack on Poland on September 1st, 1939. Then the French declared war on Germany. World War broke out. In the early stages of World War II, the United States still did not choose to directly participate in the war immediately, due to the fact that after the end of World War I, Wilson's 14-point peace plan went bankrupt. The United States has retracted its international strategy. And the simple answer is this. After the First World War, although the United States earns a lot, national strength has greatly increased. But it did not sit firmly on the world's first deal, the outbreak of World War II. The United States can still maintain its pre-war strategy. Great War. After all, the war did not affect the continental United States for a while. America can still do business with warring nations around the world. For example, from the end of 1931 to mid-1937, the United States, like Japan, exported a large amount of metals and minerals needed for the war. This includes 90% non-steel, 90% copper, and 45% lead. In addition, more than 60% of Japan's oil also comes from the United States. After the Lugu Bridge incident, US resource exports to Japan have not stopped either. The United States remains the largest supplier of strategic raw materials to Japan. In addition to that, there are also a large number of weapons and equipment and military-made machinery and equipment exported to Japan. At that time, the United States relied on development to compete for wealth. It's like counting money and getting cramps. As early as the early 1930s, the US Congress passed the Neutrality Act, forbid the U.S. government from recapturing it into war again. At that time, the United States was in the midst of the Great Depression. The United States has no intention of participating, just want to make money. So I have always insisted on style isolationism. Watch the fire from the shore. Until 1941, President Roosevelt recognized the downsides of isolationism, intended to support the Anti-Fascist League. Therefore, with the efforts of President Roosevelt, the United States Congress passed the Concession Act. Concession aid to countries such as Britain, the Soviet Union, and China. Of course, the United States also wants to take this opportunity to acquire a large number of high-quality overseas assets. Acquire leasing rights to Army and naval bases on Allied territory. The Lend-Lease Act also greatly enhanced the combat effectiveness of the Anti-Fascist League, bringing the American economy out of the Great Depression into the division boom. And by mid-1941, Japan continues expansion in Southeast Asia. This move touches the core interests of the United States in Southeast Asia. So the United States felt that it could no longer let it go. Freeze trade with Japan. Then Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. The United States was forced to enter World War II. Declare war on Japan. Joined the anti-fascist movement. Since Pearl Harbor, the United States has launched several military strikes against Japan, including the bombing of Tokyo, Battle of Midway, and more. And in 1942, America launched the Manhattan Project. Thousands of scientists from around the world spent 3 years developing the world's first atomic bomb. By August 1945, the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan's Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan was forced to surrender unconditionally on August 15, 1945. World War II ended with an anti-fascist victory. It is not difficult to see through the 2 world wars. The main battlefields of both world wars were not on American soil. This provides good environmental conditions for the United States to develop its economy vigorously. And peaceful environmental conditions have also allowed the global economic and technological talent to branch out. Two world wars made the United States go to war again to make it strong. The old colonial empires led by Britain and France were in the two world wars. The national power has been weakened, unable to maintain large overseas colonial assets. The United States picked up a bunch of big bargains. You could say that, after World War II, the old colonial empires withdrew from the stage of history. Europe is no longer the center of the world. The United States is firmly at the head of the world's leader with its military and economic strength. Transaction. Therefore, the United States gradually began to dominate the global order. Late World War II. The United States has repeatedly battered Japan on the battlefield, and in the Western battlefield in Europe. And the Soviets got a foothold. The whole situation began to turn around. The final victory of the Anti-Fascist League in the war is just around the corner. The establishment of a new world economic order after the war was also put on the agenda. On July 1, 1944, delegates from 4 countries gather in Bretton Woods Park, USA, jointly sign an agreement, and the establishment of an International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. The two constitute a new economic order, also known as Bretton Woods System. The Bretton Woods System was the post-war monetary order led by the United States. It is the position of the Jinhui team based on the US dollar and gold. In fact, it is time to establish an international monetary system centered on the US dollar. Basically, the dollar is pegged to gold. The currencies of the member countries of the International Monetary Fund maintain a fixed law with the US dollar. The operation of the Bretton Woods monetary system is closely related to the credibility and status of the dollar. The formation of the Bretton Woods system has played a positive role in the recovery and development of the world economy. At the time, this system contributed to the stability of the international financial market, and it was instrumental in the post-war recovery. However, due to the unbalanced development of capitalism, the balance of economic power in the major capitalist countries has changed repeatedly. The contradictions and flaws inherent in the dollar-centered international monetary system are increasingly exposed. Finally, in 1973, countries adopt the Jamaica Agreement. The dollar is no longer pegged to gold. The volume of Bretton Woods collapsed, but there's no denying it. Through a series of operations in World War II, the United States became the greatest winner in World War II. Not only did the United States win the war in the end, and economically, the United States is competing for wealth. According to statistics, towards the end of World War II, the United States held more than 75% of the world's official gold reserves at that time. Almost all the world's gold was kept in the United States through the mechanism of war. The dominance of the dollar was established at this time. Late World War II, United States and United Kingdom. The 3 countries of the Soviet Union held a series of summits. Among them was the Cairo Conference against Communism in Fulton, USA, unveiling the Cold War. In 1947, US President Truman delivered a self-examination speech. The Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union officially began. At the same time, also in 1947, the United States came up with Project Magel. The plan was designed to aid the economic recovery of Western European countries after the war, to counter the expansion of the Soviet Union and communism in Europe. And the Marshall Plan was America's most successful strategic plan. The United States controlled Western Europe economically and politically. Establish a world pattern led by the United States. The Truman speech also marked a change in the isolationist foreign policy of the United States. Global expansion. To better counter the Soviet Union. In August 1949, the United States is also competing with Western Europe. North America and other major developed countries have established an international military bloc. That's the North Atlantic Treaty, NATO for short. The Soviet Union united Eastern European countries to form the Warsaw Pact in 1955, as a response to the US-led NATO. During the Cold War era of the global hegemony between the United States and the Soviet Union, the United States continues to expand overseas through war and political means. At the same time, The U.S.-Soviet hegemony also allowed the United States to. It took off in military and technology. And during the Cold War, the United States participated directly or indirectly in the Korean War, Vietnam War, the war in Afghanistan, etc. There was also the Berlin Crisis, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and more. These are nothing more than the products created by the global hegemony and expansion of the United States and the Soviet Union. However, with the great changes in Eastern Europe in 1989 and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the Cold War ended. The two-tier arrangement and the Yalta system also eventually disintegrated. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact was officially dissolved. The Warsaw Pact and NATO were both products of the Cold War era, designed to confront each other. Checks and balances. But NATO, led by the United States, did not collapse with the end of the Cold War. Instead, it keeps growing. It has developed into a global shitstick. The collapse of the Soviet Union also left the United States without any competitors on a global scale. No country has the strength to challenge its global dominance.